I love the theme of Holocron around complexity and chaos. And it got me thinking about the work that I've been doing sort of my entire career and before that, which has to do, as I would argue, with breaking artificial barriers, artificial constructions that we often use to simplify the way in which we think about the world and ourselves in it, but mitigate our capacity to really experience and leverage the power of complexity. So in so doing, that's sort of what I was holding when I brought this together. So let me just share a roadmap that I used for this session in terms of breaking the binary. And when I'm talking about the binary, it's sort of that simplistic either or bifurcated way in which we tend to think about things. Things as being black or white, rich or poor, male or female, up or down, us or them. And so I want to interrupt that. While it's appealing, as I said, to our brains to categorize, it's not necessarily reflective of people's lived experience. And if we're trying to create sustainable change, our capacity to understand, appreciate, build greater comfort with complexity, and then navigate within that allows us to, I truly believe, create outcomes that are much more sustainable, because the world is dynamic and people inside of it are. So I've put this roadmap together, and it's not linear necessarily. It's partly linear in terms of the conceptual framework, but I want to weave some things through. In addition to setting some context for why breaking the binary matters, we're going to focus particularly on LGBTQIA+, and I know that's a mouthful, identity and inclusion. And we're going to unpack what that means and to look at the diversity and complexity along the spectrum of identities that speaks to. And I want to intersperse the lived experience of people whose identities are not necessarily binary. And I'll use some short video to do so, because giving voice to that, and I want to invite those of us in the room who have experience, either lived or otherwise, to share that as well. And the idea about promoting inclusion and leveraging the possibility of that inclusion, I'm going to pull forward two core concepts from Holos. One is around authenticity, which is our capacity to build and create or enable the conditions that bring forth our best self in an ongoing way, developing ourselves and others in an ongoing way to be our best versions of ourselves. And interdependence, the idea that our efforts and the outcomes that we strive for are linked, that I can't do it alone. What happens to me has an impact on you, and that the importance of cooperation and vulnerability and trust is central to harnessing the power of that interdependence. So throughout this, I'm going to give us a chance to reflect on the messages that this speaks to in terms of authenticity and interdependence. Does that work? You with me?
That's great.
Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about my journey in this space. So I've been doing what I would call leadership development work for 40 years. It's as hard to believe for me as it is probably for you. But my journey,
so young, Richard, how is that possible?
I'm almost 65.
No way.
Way.
No.
Yeah.
Never would have guessed it.
So, well, there weren't child labor laws. But I came to this space of leadership development through my DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, with the understanding and recognition that for diversity, inclusion, and equity to occur, to be sustainable, that leadership was required. But I didn't really understand that when I started in my DEI work. So my DEI work brought me to what I would call leadership development work. What brought me to my DEI work was my work around LGBTQIA plus inclusion, though back in the day, that's not what we called it. I mention this because when I started in my career, I came out as a gay person when I was in my teens. So when I entered into the professional world, my focus of my work, I was on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, was how do we create schooling environments that embrace and recognize the experience of LGBT people, students, staff, et cetera, and often use my own experience to sort of teach around that and do research around that. So I was not just a gay professional, I was a professional gay person. I was sort of showing up, telling my story, those sorts of things. And so my path into this work is in some ways, when I talk to colleagues, almost in reverse, that many folks who do leadership development work come to DEI and LGBT inclusion through their leadership development work or their work in organizations. And my pathway was sort of the mirror of that. But lots has changed and a lot has not over those 40 some years. So one thing that has changed is this whole acronym of LGBTQIA+, which, as I said, I know is a mouthful. So just to humor me, let me get everybody to unmute. And let's, on the count of three, I'll say, give me an L. Let's get what you think these letters stand for. So on the count of three, give me an L.
Lesbian.
Lesbian.
Great. G.
Gay.
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 B.
Bisexual.
Binary.
T.
Transsexual.
Transsexual.
Transitioning.
Transsexual. G. Q.
Queer.
Questioning.
Queer questioning. I. A.
Asexual.
A can be sometimes asexual or ally. And the plus?
Everything else.
Everything else, yeah.
Well, both everything else and recognizing the reality that language and identities are fluid, and that there'll be more that will emerge.
Yeah, just don't limit it.
It's unlimited. And so here's the other thing, when I've done this for years, give me an L, give me a G, and I've added letters. But what typically happens, as we saw here, is as you get beyond the L, the G, and maybe even the B, there's more uncertainty. And so I feel that speaks to sort of the dynamics of this. So the dynamic nature of sexual identity. I want to unpack this and give us some sort of guidelines for how to do that in a way that both supports our learning and growth, but most importantly, facilitates conversation. So I really want to invite you to embrace humble curiosity. None of us knows everything. And so this is an invitation to be curious, to ask questions, which may require a certain amount of courage. And when we think about language, is to recognize that it's a double-edged sword. So if I'm not sure whether B, I think Tessa, you said binary. Is it binary? Is it bisexual? Let's not try and use language as an excuse not to speak up. So if we worried we're going to get it wrong, let me just say we will. At some point when we communicate with folks, we will get it wrong according to the listener's preferred language or the social context, historical context, and our capacity to embrace that and recover from that and not hang ourselves or other people up by the thumbs is important. But language does matter. And so I think there is a responsibility to stay plugged into the impact of language and the changing nature of it. And the changing nature of it is because it's contextual, geographic, historical, cultural, and familial meaning. I'm 64, going on 65. So the Q, which in some like high school settings gets used as questioning, but in more broad environments, it's used as queer. I have a difficult time with that language personally, because the word queer when I grew up was a weapon. And I know in the 1990s in the United States, queer studies, queer nation, there was a politics and an academic reclaiming of that word that I could not center myself in, and still struggle with it, though it's and I just recognize that. So that it has personal meanings as well. But let's not get hung up by language in terms of keeping the conversation from happening. So let's pay attention to context. I'm most familiar with US-centric examples. I'll use some of those, but not all of those. And I want to invite you to bring the contexts you're familiar with to the conversation as well. And the bottom line is complete understanding of the complexity will never happen and is not required to demonstrate interdependence or compassion or understanding in terms of at an interpersonal level. I don't understand gravity and how it works, but I have great respect for it. So I would hold it similarly in that regard. So here's what we're going to do. How many of you have either raised kids or have children in your life or have had children in your life that you've had a close relationship with in terms of raising? So let's say a child you're raising, a child you're responsible for, a child you care about, earnestly asks, let's say they're 5 to 10-year-old, what's a man? What's a woman? How might you answer that question? You can just unmute yourself and shout it out. What's a man?
Well, I mean, there's an obvious biological answer.
Meaning, well, unpack that.
So, depending on their gender, you can be fairly clear about the physical differences,
Such as
the having or lack of a penis would be a clear biological difference at that age. But I'm not sure that's a very helpful answer.
because
Because it doesn't. I don't think it really answers the intent behind the question. I mean, it's a very literally superficial answer to the question.
Okay.
So it's a surprisingly difficult question to answer.
Yeah, right. How might others approach it? Angela?
It's really interesting how tongue-tied I feel through lack of experience or perhaps a desire to get it right. Yeah, just being vulnerable.
Yeah.
So yes, there's.
If that's where you are, Angela, you're doing better than me, because I'm not sure I have any idea what the answer is.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to have that confidence to talk about things like this, and I don't know why. Previously I was a school teacher, and when we did sex education, just saying the scientific words for parts of the body, I found so difficult, and it does make you wonder why. It's fine to say hand, it's fine to say foot, but you start, naming more sexual parts of the body, it becomes difficult.
So we don't create pet words for my finger. We don't call it your pointy pointer, but we do about genitals, for example.
Yeah.
And then, as Neil's suggesting, there seems to be, if we reduce it to something, and Neil, you were focusing on what I would frame, and I was sort of pushing you a little here around the biological, because even if we speak specifically biologically, it's complex. So we have, as you said, penis. Are we going to talk gonads? Are we going to talk chromosomes, hormones, internal genitals, external genitals, and then the politics of that? And again, this is not about getting it right or wrong, but Neil, you said having a penis or not, or the lack of a penis. And my sense is that lands for some people who were born, let's say, with a vulva, as not, but may not experience a lack. and yet the centering of a male genital is very common in the way in which we construct our ideas. I mean, this is a whole nother conversation.
We were talking to a 5-year-old at the time.
Correct. And there's that whole thing. And I think, Neil, where I thought you were going to go, which is a useful thing, is to actually find out what is this 5 or 10-year-old really wanting to know. Question. But for our purposes, I want to suggest that where you all got to pretty quickly is what on the surface may seem like pretty simplistic is much more complicated. And it can create some discomfort, not just because of our cultural associations with having this kind of conversation, but we lack, I think, the binary thinking creates an inability to focus on the true complexity of this. Because when we want to talk then about biology is one way to answer, but gender roles and other aspects of when we think about gender versus sex, what does that mean? So I want to unpack some of that for us, because I think the greater capacity we have to understand this will help us work through some of the vulnerability and potential discomfort that creates. So I'm going to share a model. I'm going to use a model on sexual identity. When I'm defining sexual identity, I mean it as who we are as sexual beings, who other folks are as sexual beings. And this model has 4 components, and I've chosen it not because it's the best model or the only model, but to me, the definition of a good model is it explains things, and the more it can explain, the better the model is. And this, I feel, does a good job of looking at both enough complexity in clarifying it, while still being able to sort of, in the time that we have a more simple conversation about the dynamic nature of sexual identity. But by definition, it has some limits. It's a roadmap for a conversation. It will give us some common language. And there are, as I said, 4 components that are paradoxically distinct and interrelated. So each speaks to something somewhat unique, but because people live at the intersection of all of these, there's a relationship between them, even though they're distinct. Each poses a question, which I'll highlight, because that can help us differentiate each component from the other, while also recognizing there's some common ground in that. So, as I said, the model has 4 parts, and each poses a question. I'll give you the model up front, and then we'll go quickly through each stage. The first is what's called sex assigned at birth, which is the sort of sometimes thought of as the biosexual component. And the question it poses is, what sex am I? Now, obviously, an infant who's being born is not asking that question, but let me tell you, everybody around that child, that infant, asks that question. So what sex am I, or is the child? Gender identity begs the question of who am I? My belief in myself of who I am in terms of my own gender. Gender expression begs the question of how do I appear? How do I present myself to the world to represent publicly my gender? And sexual orientation has to do with whom do I love? And I've created a space between the top 3 and the bottom one to indicate that the top 3 really have to do with my relationship with myself and my own gender. And the bottom one is really interpersonal, my relationship, my romantic attachments to other people, not disconnected from the other 3, but is looking at a slightly different component of our sexual identity. And probably at this point, in my experience, the component of sexual identity that people are most familiar with compared to the other 3. So let's move forward into them. But I want to just say, none of these are binary. None of the 4 are binary. Each exists along a spectrum of possibility. And yet a reminder that when we bifurcate either or, it appeals to our brain, but it mitigates complexity and interdependence, a recognition that if you're the I in that model, which we'll talk about in a moment, that somehow that's not, your experience and my experience are unrelated, when in fact they're interdependent. And binary thinking also can assume that the dimensions are immutable, fixed and don't change. and there's evidence to suggest that people are much more dynamic along these dimensions than previously thought or comfortably lived with by others. So sex assigned at birth begs the question, as I said, what sex am I? Why is this such a compelling question? The first question we have gender reveal parties now, right? Because that question is
only in America, Richard, seriously.
Don't worry, it will be here soon.
well, let's talk. But why is that so important for folks? Do you think?
Don't know.
Sense of identity of some form.
Say that again, Tess.
It allows you to identify with that child more easily.
Yeah, because our construction of the world tends to be so binary. I'll give you a simple example. My mother had to know what the sex of the child was, loved the idea of when she was alive. She didn't have gender reveal parties when she was growing up. But when people chose to know or find out when pregnant what the sex of the child was, she was thrilled, because then she knew what kind of gift to buy. Yeah. But it sets up this idea that there's a pink and there's a blue, and I'm less comfortable with the yellow and the green. Hospitals historically have been set up with sort of a binary way of thinking about gender. You know, babies in a bassinet in a nursery are often given historically bonnets that were colored, or cards, index cards that were either pink or blue. So we construct the birth as if it's answering a binary question. And here's the thing: when we think about that question about, my slides are frozen. There we go. Sex at birth is the label we give an infant at birth based most frequently on genital appearance. Genital appearance is influenced by many factors. From the point of conception through the first 6 or 9 weeks of development, all embryos are identical except at a chromosomal level. Starting around 6 or 9 weeks of gestation, a process of differentiation can start to occur, and many things can happen in that process that either differentiate the developing fetus into a binary male, differentiated male, or female, or some more fluid expression of sexual identity. Not all infants are born clearly differentiated female or male, so the compelling nature of wanting to answer that question assumes that they are. There are at least 7 biosexual gateways that determine or influence what happens at sex, answering that question at birth. There's the chromosomal, and we assume that it's either XX or XY, and that's not true. The chromosomal platform can influence gonadal development, so all fetuses have gonads, but depending on chromosomes and hormone production and the timing of those, do the gonads differentiate as testes or ovaries? And then we might have a hormone production, but do our cells synthesize the hormones to differentiate at a biological level the developing fetus or not? What does that mean in terms of our internal organs, our external genitalia, and what's the platform that creates for the secondary sex characteristics, which are more likely to evolve at puberty? So if my chromosomes and my hormones are not necessarily responding as in a binary way, will I develop facial hair? Will my hips widen? Will my breasts develop? Will my voice change in a particular way? Will I develop an Adam's apple? Those sorts of secondary sex characteristics are dependent on some of these other factors. So in this dimension, when we went back to the LGBTQIA, the I stands for intersex. So intersex is an umbrella term for people born with variations in sex characteristics along any of these 7 gateways that fall outside of a traditional binary male or female construction. Some of these are clear at birth that it's non-binary. Some of it is ambiguous in some situations. Some don't show up until later in life. But the bottom message here is sex is more than genitals, though we look to the genitals as our marker to answer the question of what sex am I or what sex is that child. So how often are children born so noticeably atypical in terms of genitalia that a specialist in sex differentiation is called in? Neil?
No idea. No idea at all. It would be a pure guess.
Okay. Anybody want to?
Three.
Three. One in every 2,000.
Yeah.
Is that why that, Tess?
It's a guess.
Okay. Well, lucky guess. But there's 2 points I want to make here. One is one in every 2,000. I'll give you some idea of what that actually means in a moment. But it's probably more than that when we think about those who are born not so noticeably atypical that a specialist is brought in. Some are born where some of the intersex identity and experience doesn't show up until childhood or adolescence. So we wouldn't call in a specialist. So there are many more subtle forms than the obvious. But what does 1 in 2,000 look like? So according to current medical data, about 1.7% of people are born intersex. That's about the same percentage of people who are born natural redheads, and more than the 0.3% chance of babies being born as identical twins without an in vitro fertilization intervention. How many of you know natural redheads? Yeah, probably all of us. Then I would ask, how many of us know people who are intersex?
Not knowingly.
Not knowingly necessarily. And so statistically speaking, that possibility is out there, but we may not know it.
It doesn't come up in polite conversation very much.
Well, yeah, so, and then, yes, but it does foster this sense of the binary being the norm, and then polite and proper sort of fuels the silence in some regards about it. So if we look at those 7 gateways in the medical literature, there's at least 29 different sexes biosexually that exist out there, that only 2 of which are clearly differentiated as male or female. So there's greater diversity along this spectrum than many of us are even aware. When you think about that, what does that do to your brain? I mean, your mind.
So I find this particularly fascinating, and I always at a young age, when I think it was Kenzie who did the thing around sexuality being on a continuum, and that just made such inordinate sense to me, and I found it a really comforting point. And but I find it really interesting because we were talking with I have a son who's 8 years old, and we were taking him to Pride, and we were talking about all the variety of people he would see and witness. And my wife said, we're talking about it, she said, and some people don't feel like a man or a woman. And he said, that's me. Mm-hmm. And it was so clear in his mind. And there was something beautiful in the simplicity of it, but it also has become quite complex for him because his mind as an 8-year-old is quite binary and quite polar. When you look at their learning, it's about near or far, it's short or tall. It's they are learning to go from here to concrete. And suddenly you've got a child who's sitting with, I'm not in the binary, I'm in a gray space. And it's it's a concept that the brain matures into. And it's quite a hard thing for him to feel like not one of something that's obvious. Now, if the world were more gray and the world were more spectrum, the language might not be quite as divisive, as you say. But particularly at his age, I think he's finding it quite hard to feel like he doesn't quite belong in either. And we often say to our kids, you can be anything you want, you can do this. And actually at that young age, it's quite frightening for him to be anything rather than something. But as he grows, I think that will be wonderful. Yeah.
Here's my hope and my gut.
Yeah.
The fact that you brought him to Pride and he, as you told that story, comfortably said, that's me.
Oh, absolutely. That's
that is
wonderful.
not unrelated.
Yeah. Oh,
And
no. That's a wonderful outcome for us. It's wonderful, but yeah, but still a little bit scary for his mind. Yeah.
For sure. Because what he was witnessing and having questions about, but in the loving support of a family, is to say the world isn't binary.
Yeah.
And yet we do live, and he's socializing both at in a personal, communal space that is trying to probably force a binary. And as you're suggesting, developmentally, there's some things happening in the brain. Though I have to say, in my experience in dealing with young children, at an interpersonal level, they seem to be able to get it and feel more comfortable with folks whose sexual identity in any of these spaces that we're going to talk about may be different than their own. That's, and have an appreciation for, oh, well, they're just different than I am. When it's, how different am I? That I think is much more dependent on what is the environment I'm in. Does it foster the capacity for me to see myself, to feel heard, versus have my family be my first source of bullying, whether that's intentional or unintentional.
Sure, and it's interesting. It's just at that particularly young age. But my other son, who's 11, is just absolutely fine with grayness and fine, and I think, and he finds it quite peculiar when people like, you know, identify as being gay or something, because he just feels like it's such an unnecessary, you know, descriptor or boxing of someone, where it's where there's just such an openness that he finds it quite an old concept to identify as something.
Well, the world, however, historically, as we've been saying, is built on this binary. So in the intersex space, historically, and still today, the medical community in particular has addressed intersex children and infants with a surgical knife. And the idea being that it is that we need to create a binary biosexual child
retrofit them into,
out of the thought that if the parents or the people raising this child are not convinced of the child's gender, that somehow that will be confusing to the child who we think of as being very concrete. And it is better in the eyes of the historical, surgical, medical philosophy to create a biological male or female than to raise it from our own ambiguity. However, what we have started to see is that's not always the case. That there's a price to that, to not, there is a price many intersex people, when we hear their stories, say they have paid for that. So historically, have we created more male or female intersexed people?
Definitely, we would have gone male, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
No.
Seems pretty. Oh wow.
Because surgically, it's easier to create female
To
genitals.
remove.
Just cheap then.
Well, that philosophy came out of at a time when the science, the surgical science, defaulted to, again, wanting to create something that was, the genitals should not tell a lie, was the medical practice. So many intersex people and trans people today are arguing for not having medical surgical intervention. And under the umbrella of belief that a child, when the child is able to decide, we should let the child decide. And there's both a principle and a politic around self-determination. Bodily autonomy is a human right. And in the United States, this is not disconnected from the conversation around reproductive rights, which is also sort of regulated by a medical political community. So these posters that you're saying, surgery, should have asked me, why operate when you can wait, come from the parts of the intersex community, which are advocating for more bodily autonomy. But let's give voice to folks who are intersex. I have a short video of folks who are intersex talking about their own experience. And let me just say, if you're intersex, if you love and know people who are intersex, their experience may not match yours. But pay attention, notice what you notice as you watch the video. What stands out for you, whose stories speak to you, what are the messages that emerge? It's just over 3 minutes.
Raise your hands if you have testes. I'm Pigeon.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are Intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender non-conforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful, you're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
In watching that, what came up for you? What stood out for you?
Well, it's horrific to hear that there's any individual, but a community so large, you have to reassure each other that they're worthy of being loved.
And the horror of institutionalized genital mutilation of children.
Yeah.
I mean,
Just because it doesn't fit with the doctor's idea of what it should be.
And that term, that he was still patronizing to the person about their own existence. He knew better.
And then
they knew better.
And then my own ignorance as well.
Yeah, and I felt that as well, because, you know, the gender reveal thing, at the beginning, it makes you really realize how your behavior is contributing to that. You know, if you're asking the gender of a baby when it's born, you're contributing to that binary idea, and you're being really you're excluding so many people by using that language. And I think that really hits home how unintentionally you're just almost conditioned to behave in a, you know, male female kind of that's the language that's used, and it needs to change.
Well, and I appreciate Karen, you're talking about this sort of the unintentional ways in which we might reinforce this binary thinking. And one might argue, Neil, you framed forced genital mutilation as a way of sort of the horror of that, I think you said. And yet, as the story was shared, the surgeon who recommended that had no regrets. So my sense is if we asked them, they were being well-intended. And yet,
I mean, I was consciously tying it into the horror around female genital mutilation that likes to be perpetuated in the press, and it's not different.
Correct.
It's the same.
Yeah, and to me, that's the interdependence part. It's not dissimilar from that when we talk about reproductive rights in the United States, this bodily autonomy. It's not disconnected from. And yet what's easy in both of those examples is to suggest that if I, as a non-intersex cisgender male, say I want to put my stake in the ground, am I doing that to support other people without recognizing the implications for my own relationship with my own gender? That the ways in which I've been raised that are very binary also impact me, and the capacity then to have greater aperture around possibility of what gender means and looks like is freeing for me as well. But that's a space that's sometimes hard to traverse. So intersex is the experience across sex assigned as at birth. Gender identity has to do with that deep question of who am I? It's the personal experience at a heart, mind, body, and soul level of my belief that I'm male or female or some other way in which I identify my gender. Cisgender, which I just used that term a moment ago, is the term for folks today who identify as having their gender identity, their internal sense of self, in alignment with their sex assigned at birth. Cis meaning same, on the same side as. Transgender, and I think when we did the LGBTQI and we yelled it out, someone also said transsexual. So transgender is the umbrella term for people whose gender identity doesn't align with sex assigned at birth. Transsexual is used less today, and it's more focused on the term transgender because the gender is more than just the biological, and sex sometimes connotes for folks a reduction to the biological. Non-binary is also an umbrella term for many of the identities that exist in this dimension of who am I beyond just binary women or men. Some non-binary people use non-binary as their identity. Some name themselves as transgender. So there's a lot of diversity in the naming of who am I and the answering of this question. What we should pay attention to is the concept of misgendering, which is when we use language through pronouns, titles, communication that don't honor or match the individual's sense of who they are. And people use language in lots of different ways, and we will misgender people. So our capacity to manage that is important with grace and forgiveness of ourselves and others. And dead naming, some of you may have heard this term, is when we use gender language or someone's name that they no longer use. It may have been the name they were born with or the gender they were assigned at birth but no longer use. And gender identities, the way in which people identify in this space runs a gamut. Here are just some of them. Transgender girls or women are folks whose sex assigned at birth was male but identify as women or girls. Transgender boy or men, non-binary, gender fluid, agender. We'll talk in a moment about two-spirited and the Fa'afafine and the Hijra. But there's others, and the language will change. And you don't need to memorize all this. Again, it's just a matter of recognizing that there's more than a binary here. So I do want to talk about the two-spirited and Fa'afafine for a second, because what's happening, at least in the US today, this is huge on a political landscape, but is the idea that this is some new age fad around gender expression and gender identity. So there's laws you're probably hearing about to criminalize drag in public performance and gender affirming care for transgender folks, but it's not a new age fad. So what you're seeing here on the screen is the two-spirited pride flag, which in many Native American communities is the flag that identifies people who are known as two-spirited. And in many Native American cultures historically, two-spirited people who don't identify as male or female in a binary way, actually historically held roles of power, position of esteem and high value. They were seen as holding the energies and spirits of all people and all genders, and often were the either shamanistic or the negotiators of conflict, because they were able to see perspectives of many and not just one. Here are some pictures. So on the upper left are some historical photos of people who are identified as two-spirited in some Native American cultures. The Fa'afafine in the upper right are Polynesians from Samoa who identify historically referred to as the third sex, and so are the Hijra in India. Now, I don't know what your cultural experience is. My partner is Native American, for example. And what's interesting around this, I'll just talk from my own personal experience, is the two-spirited component of his cultural identity and his family. Colonialism and assimilation has really changed the meaning of some of that. And so colonialism has impacted how many communities see non-binary, transgender, intersex people, and have disconnected the pride and the power of that role from the community. So it's sometimes it's the colonial binary got imposed and internalized. So we see less of that in today's communities among indigenous communities. We could spend a whole history on here. But since representation matters, here are some images of people you might know or recognize who identify as transgender or non-binary. Who do you know and who do you not know who's up here?
Susie Izzard.
Susie Izzard, you know?
I don't know personally, but no.
Eddie.
You know
Eddie Susie.
No, Susie, she's during the week. She
also,
asked me, yeah.
But also been open to both.
Open to both, that's right, yeah.
And so her journey has evolved, right? Long journey and has evolved. And you have Kim Petras, who just won the Grammy, and Elliot Page, who won an Academy Award. So these are people, and again, I'm going back to thinking about your story, Mark, with when you were at the parade with your son, is representation matters. So
it does.
And for me, it's not even if I don't, for me, it matters not that I identify as transgender or non-binary, but it gives me a capacity to open the aperture around how I think about my own gender and represent it in the world. Representation and visibility make a difference. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when I first learned about extroversion and introversion, that gave me a sense of self-awareness and knowledge and understanding and permission and all of that sort of thing. And I get it. I get that totally.
Well, let's give voice to those who identify as transgender, for those of us who either have less contact or have a singular contact with individuals in our lives who may be transgender. Again, these stories may not match your own, but notice what you notice, and what are the messages, particularly around authenticity, interdependence, complexity. So we'll start with, I think Rose speaks first.
My name is Rose. I'm a transgender girl. I was born a boy, but I always knew that I was a girl.
My name is Devon. I'm a trans male. That means I was born female, and I live now as a male. When I was 3, I decided that I was going to grow up and be a father and marry Janet Jackson.
She would write letters to Santa Claus, to the Tooth Fairy. When would I be turned into a girl? Could you turn me into a girl?
I'm Jay. I'm a non-binary trans person. That means that I'm not a man, nor am I a woman. I was raised as a girl, but when I learned about non-binary gender identities, it was like a whole new world had opened up for me.
My name is Ronnie, and my sister Ellie is transgender.
Ellie told us on her 4th birthday that she was a girl in her heart and her brain. And I said, "You're my favorite princess boy." And what did you say, Ellie?
No, I'm a princess girl.
My struggling point was this had to be a phase.
The reality is acceptance takes a while.
I was terrified of coming out. I was afraid of losing friends, family, loved ones. I was afraid of this discrimination and potential violence I could face.
I was so terrified that I wanted to die. Got threatening letters. One of the quotes said, do us a favor, Paula, and put that gun back up to your head and finish the job.
I'm scared as a dad for her safety, whether a society will be as accepting as her family and her friends are.
I feel embarrassed and unsafe when people out me to other people.
If there isn't a gender-neutral bathroom available, when there are only men's and women's bathrooms, I have to make a decision about how I look that day and whether there's more risk for me going into the men's room or the women's room.
I was chased by 4 people in the metro for being transgender.
I have been denied health care. I have been gawked at. I've been humiliated. I have been physically assaulted several times when using a bathroom.
Seeing her face the first time we let her wear a dress outside of the house, pretty special.
You're different, that's okay. Just keep on being yourself.
Support means listening, maybe not understanding, but just listening and being there for me.
Pushing back on jokes or offensive comments at the expense of transgender people.
The easiest way to support transgender people is to follow their lead.
Supporting transgender people means letting them be who they are.
I'm proud to be trans because I want to be myself.
I'm proud to be trans because I think life is too short to be anything besides what you are. This is who I am.
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 What spoke to you?
I thought that was extremely powerful. And what spoke to me was the, kind of don't be perfect in trying to support.
What about that spoke to you that was so powerful, not being perfect?
the real humanness, you know, forget the labels.
Yeah.
There's humankind.
Yeah.
Can we be kind humans to each other?
Yeah.
You know, the difference, the part about being different and perceived as different, and on the outside, or the, you know, kind of where do I fit, that resonates at a personal level.
Well, and I also think both Angela, you and others said earlier around the question of how do you answer what's a man, the vulnerability that you spoke to of getting it wrong. And it's not about perfect.
Yeah.
It's about connection.
Yeah.
And helping people know they've been seen.
Yeah.
Others, what spoke to you?
Good, being truly authentic to who you are and how you feel. And that takes courage and vulnerability.
Yep. Courage and vulnerability, and the importance of authenticity, and the power of that held in an environment where there's danger and risk simultaneously, and yet there's danger and risk in not being authentic in yourself as well. Neil?
The parental support and the the realization of how many, that's probably relatively less frequent, and there must be so many who've not had that parental support in history, and who've really suffered as a consequence.
Correct. So parental, Mark?
I really identified with the father who was scared for his child, because it is such a toxic world, and it's one thing to have a loving little cocoon, but knowing that the reality of those kids was being chased, being hounded, being trolled, being hated. That's a frightening thought.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And as the one mother who said, the father who said, I'm afraid for my child, the mother who said, acceptance takes time, it's a journey. And so there's the individual journey as as the parent or a loved one that I'm on, but then there's the broader environmental process, so that I can create a safe space at home. But we don't just live at home. So what's going to happen on the street? And the timing of this video was produced in 2016. In the United States, this was in the prior presidential administration. There was a lot of politics around bathroom laws, which is partly why this got centered around using bathrooms here. But I think that's a metaphor for a lot of things. But it's, will I be attacked? Will I be hurt? Will I be limited in public space? And we're seeing in the United States, again, a resurgence of that same thing around how do we create inclusion? How do we, and to recognize that impacts everybody when people are not able to be their authentic self. What's the vulnerability around creating policies in organizations? And practices in organizations, and what the messages are that get sent. I'm going to move us forward because we've got two more dimensions, and I want to make sure we have time to hear another important voice here. So gender expression asks the question of how do I appear, which is how do I present myself and communicate my gender publicly in the world through behavior and mannerisms, which are by definition culturally and geographic and historically contextual. So gender conforming people are folks whose gender expression generally falls in alignment with what's expected in that whatever context they find themselves in for masculinity or femininity in a binary way. Gender non-conforming people, and some folks in the video you said you saw identified themselves as non-conforming, are people whose expression of their gender doesn't fall along clear binary lines. And here again are some ways in which people choose to identify when it comes to this space, and we don't need to memorize all of them. And because representation matters, here are some folks who are both contemporary and historic, who represent sort of a gender non-conforming expression. Who on here do you know and who on here do you not know or wonder why they're up there?
The only one I don't know is Billy Porter.
Okay, so Billy Porter is a Tony Award winner, performer and Grammy-winning singer who is probably best known for winning the Tony Award for Kinky Boots, but is also become a fashion icon in degendering fashion. As you can see, this is, I think, from 3 Academy Awards ago. Anyone else you're wondering who they are or why they're up there? Let me just speak to Marlene Dietrich and Katharine Hepburn. And I want to just use it to sort of take a historical reference and broaden it in a contemporary way. They were both women who broke gender norms in terms of their presentation and wore trousers at a time when women were looked down upon for wearing trousers, and in some situations had their gender representation policed. The history of policing people's gender presentation in the United States goes back at a legal level to the 1840s, where there were laws put in place called masquerade laws, which prevented people from representing themselves other than who they were. And this emerged out of rural farmers who painted their face and dressed as Native Americans in order to avoid paying taxes on their land. But that's not how the laws were then enforced. They were enforced against women, cisgender women, and trans and non-binary people, more men than women, who transgressed gender norms through the 1960s. So in the United States, the Stonewall Revolution, which happened in New York City, was really mobilized and targeted, mobilized against the targeting of trans and non-binary people who were mostly men, people who were born as male, who lived or presented as female, and were being routinely arrested by the police. And these are the folks who fought back. And even today, as I said, we're revisiting this cycle of criminalizing that behavior. People know where the word drag comes from?
No.
Drag was originated by William Shakespeare, because Shakespeare, when he was writing his plays, women were not allowed to perform on stage. So in the margins of his plays, the character was indicated to dress as girl, D-R-A-G. It was an acronym for dressed as girl.
How funny. In the UK, and I think I'm right in thinking this was in the 60s, certainly in the 70s, there was a strong tradition of entertainers, male entertainers dressing as women.
Absolutely.
Did that also exist in the US?
Correct.
Yes. With people being prosecuted for.
No, and that's where this is so ironic, that you have, my examples are more US, but you have entertainers like Bob Hope and Milton Berle and Flip Wilson and people who were wildly popular, RuPaul, who are not necessarily persecuted in this way. This was about policing people's public. And here's the difference. I mean, so drag is historically a form of entertainment.
So doing it on stage was okay?
Yes. Well, it was sort of okay, because what they did to police it, and this is where I just learned this recently, this is the history of lip syncing, is there were laws that prevented musicians from playing in clubs where people cross-dressed. So to avoid, because they couldn't get musicians to back them up, they put records on and then just lip synced to the great standards, and that's where the sort of tradition of lip syncing came. But there was a history of policing, but it was targeting people for whom this was both an identity and a source of expression and a statement. Drag is often a statement, but not everybody presents themselves in the world as a form of entertainment. This isn't a form of expressing my identity for many folks. And so that's where some of the pushback came from. The last is sexual orientation, which has to do with whom do I love, which is the romantic, sexual, physical attraction to one gender, the other gender, both genders, no genders. And so again, a range of identities that people choose to name themselves, and you don't have to memorize them all. Of these 4 components, which is the only one that's public?
Gender expression.
By definition, it's gender expression. Yet what we do based on gender expression is often make assumptions about the others.
Yeah.
So we assume some things about who they think they are, what their sex assigned at birth may be. So here's what I want to. This aired 2 weeks ago. This is from a tech conference in LA called Upfront Summit, which is the largest tech conference one of the largest tech conferences. This is March 2nd of this month. Jamie Lee Curtis interviewing Alok Vaid-Menon, who's a performance artist, thought leader, poet, writer, uses they, them pronouns, identifies as a non-binary queer person. And pay attention to what speaks to you around authenticity and interdependence as Alok speaks about their experience.
There are over 400 pieces of anti-trans legislation that have been introduced in 2023 alone, and it's only March, mind you. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's the best of times in that our community is more powerful and resilient and visible than ever. It's the worst because we're having to deal with attempts to criminalize us for getting access to life-affirming healthcare, to criminalize us for existing in public. And I think what breaks my heart the most is that there's been an orchestrated attempt to make people think that trans and non-binary people have access to some mythological power, but where was that power when I got beaten on the street? Where is that power when I get spat on the street? Where's that power when I am abused relentlessly online, told to kill myself, and the same social media platforms that say happy pride to me are silent when we say it's happening? Where's that power when queer and trans people have to deal with the stochastic terrorism that leads to incidences like Colorado Springs? Where when no one believes us that we're being hunted or attacked because it's easier for them to believe that we're resilient than it is for them to remove the hands that are wrapped around our necks. This is not a minority issue. We can't talk about this as a majority of people offering to assist a minority. Why would we ever want to live in a world where people are hated for expressing themselves? That's not a world I'm interested in being a part of. There is no dignity, let alone decency, let alone glamour, let alone beauty, in a world where people are persecuted for self-expression. What this attack, what this crusade, what this theology that masquerades itself as biology is actually about, is about limiting possibility for all people. It's about telling people you have to stay in the boxes that you were confined to growing up. You don't get to figure yourself out on your own terms. And so, of course, they're coming for trans people first because we might be the most visible, but they're going to continue to come for everyone else right after that fact. And that's what we have to reframe the dialogue. This is not about allyship. This is about the creation of a more beautiful world. We live in a culture where everyone is trying to escape from their pain. We live in an escapist culture and an addiction culture that teaches people that they have to numb themselves to their pain. And that's what transphobia is, a mass coping ritual for people to numb themselves from their own pain. It is easier to demonize trans and non-binary people. It is easier to believe in lies about us than it is to confront the fact that you were made to feel like you were never going to be woman enough, that you were never going to be man enough, and that it was people who said that they loved you who did that to you first. It was people who tried their best to destroy you and called it love. It is easier to demonize me than it is to reckon with your own heartbreak. And so what I read the rising tidal wave of transphobia in this country as is a grief, an unprocessed grief, that people are all actually suffering from gender norms. And the thing about suffering is that it's really difficult to stay in, so people look for escapists. I think that so often the question gets framed, you know, trans people are advocating for our humanity, and I want us to refuse that. Actually, we know our humanity. It's those who hate us who don't. We are reminding you of your humanity. That's the difference. And the truth is, in a culture that is pain escapist, and a culture that seeks to anesthetize us from actually being present in our bodies, that's not what humanity is. Humanity is compassion. Humanity is interdependence. Humanity is, if they're coming for my friend, they're coming for me. And that's what's been lost, is in the silos and the borders that have been created, people can maintain the ultimate Western performance art called individualism, and it's disintegrating. So people often ask me, you know, why do you continue to dress as you do, to live as incandescently as you do, knowing that you'd experience violence? To which I respond, why do you continue to lie to yourself, knowing that you'll experience depression? Why do you continue to sacrifice your authenticity, knowing that you're never going to experience happiness? Why do you stay in relationships that aren't serving you? It's because you're afraid, and your fear is holding you back from actually being alive. And you hate me because I template what it means to be alive. You hate me because I show you that you didn't have to clip your own wings, that you didn't have to live an abbreviated version of your joy, that you didn't have to wait for Pride, that it could be Pride 24/7, that you didn't have to dress up for the event or the red carpet, that every motherfucking street could be your red carpet. That's why trans people are being targeted. It's not because we lack, it's because we love. And we have the audacity to love the parts of ourselves that other people hate in themselves. So what I want is actually a societal mass reckoning with healing.
What do you think? What spoke to you?
Oh, fantastically articulate.
Yeah.
Uncovering deep truths, deep uncomfortable truths that society desperately tries to ignore. Mm.
What, Neil, was there a particular truth that you felt is critical to uncover?
I think, I mean, I've been on this journey of authenticity for 20-something years now, and that right to be yourself, to celebrate who you are, without, I mean, as long as you're not impacting someone else's ability to be authentic, there should be no inhibition on that. So that.
Right.
I thought that the way that he called out this lie, that the norm that we're trying to protect is good, because it's not a good, healthy place that we're trying to protect. It's a really broken and damaged place that we're trying to hold people into.
I'm thinking about a conversation we had yesterday in one of the sessions around grief, which I feel like was a theme here. And holding on to something, not even necessarily aware that it's maybe not serving me well, but when the fear of letting go, the grief that might engender, keeps me stuck in ways that are not serving me well. And yet it requires a capacity to face that grief.
Well, and the other face of that hypocrisy, and I'm not wishing to sort of point fingers too firmly, but you know, child abuse by members of the clergy, for example, is the flip of that. That is the outlet, or is one of the outlets.
Well, and what Alok speaks to, and I'm going to send you out, I have some materials I'm going to drop into chat. One is a resource list that has a ton of resources, including the full version of this. This was a 23-minute conversation. And I'm reminding you, this is at a tech conference. And so there's a strong piece around Alok's message for the tech industry, but you could substitute the pharmaceutical industry, the education system in this. But the commodification of hate the commodification, because hate messages go viral, and that feeds advertising.
They value.
And so there's the message Alok gave here around those organizations that say happy Pride but remain silent when. So what is the obligation of systems and organizations to step into that space, to be courageous, without recognizing, and I think it requires sort of a recognition of what does that mean for my or our collective vulnerability. What were anything else in particular from the video as you think about authenticity and interdependence that you needed to hear?
Yeah, for me it was kind of the like he was talking that they were talking about how people don't want to accept it because I think it makes them vulnerable, and the part about when he's being true to himself, it makes other people feel so uncomfortable because it almost talks to them. It's like you could come out and be who you are if you wanted to be genuine, but that's a very scary place for people. So it causes other people anxiety.
Yeah. Well, and I think as Alok saying, the brilliance, I think the luminescence may have been the word they used, with which they live their life, is perhaps, I think they said, the way I template it is as a reminder of your own clipping of your own wings.
Yeah.
So, it's a mirror in some ways. And from an, I think, collective standpoint begs the question of, it's easier to focus, and Alok speaks to this in some other places, to focus on trans and non-binary people than climate change, than other big issues that affect all of us.
Yeah, and it was also the way they said they're coming for us, but they're also coming for you, because nobody's safe from that mentality.
Yep. That interdependence and that our fates are linked. Anything else? We have a couple minutes. I have a short additional clip of Alok if you're compelled by Alok. You want to see it? Okay.
Alok is great.
Yeah, Alok is amazing. So this is what beyond the gender binary means to Alok.
A world beyond the gender binary says no one else gets to tell you who you are. You get to figure that out for yourself. A world beyond the gender binary says there's no standard definition on what it means to be a man, what it means to be woman, what it means to be non-binary, what it means to be trans. There's your definition. Show me. A world beyond the gender binary says that the purpose of being alive is not to conform to pre-existing categories that were made in the 19th century as a way to control populations. The purpose of being alive is to be beautiful. And what beauty is being yourself. A world beyond the gender binary is where we champion creativity over conformity. A world beyond the gender binary is one in which we recognize that there is many ways to be human as there are human, that being alive is the ultimate creative act, and that miracles happen every day. And it's called a smile, and it's called joy. A world without the gender binary is amazing. And I think that's what makes me so sad, is because I found that capacity to be amazed. I found that capacity to find everything wonderful and delicious and delightful. And then I got beaten. And I don't know how to hold that in my life. That sense of fear of being able to sell out an entire venue talking about radical love, and then to go home and see hundreds of comments calling me a predator, saying that I'm dangerous and I deserve to die. I don't know how to hold that, to have audiences clap for me and then no one care when I'm spat on the street right afterwards. I don't know how to hold that, what it means to be called inspirational whenever I don't want to have to be inspirational. I want to be able to be boring. It's very strange, and that's why I say it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, because I think that's the only way to understand it. The times we live in are non-binary, where the algorithms that many people in this room have designed have created two Americas, where on the one hand, one America sees trans people as champions of creative self-expression, and the other sees us as predatory, violent degenerates. And so how to traverse that, where the more visible I become, the more targeted I am, and the multi-year campaigns that try to discredit everything I am by misattributing quotes to me, by doctoring images about me, to spread fear. But I think the reason that I keep coming back is because this world beyond the gender binary helped me find you, helped me find the people in this audience who care, helped me find the beautiful people, and that the only narrative I learned as a kid was that if I expressed myself, I would lose everything. But what they didn't tell me is that I was find what I was searching for all along. And that was people who are willing to be real. It's not like we're simulating something, we're actually being present. And for the first time when I speak, I can know that it's my voice. I can know that it's my tear. Even though these eyelashes, some people would call fake, I can know they're mine as well.
Very good. I used the term coming out in my first book in 2003 as a way of describing my own experience from a sort of hidden version of myself to an open, unconstrained, luminescent version of myself. And I think, and that's exactly what they're talking about there, is that you know, those people that are angry are the ones that are hiding something that they're ashamed of, that they're uncomfortable with, that their programming has made them uncomfortable with. And so they are living in that tension that you know, forces them to lash out.
Yeah, and afraid, I would argue also, and afraid of losing something, which is power or comfort or others.
Well,
what else?
I probably there's a lot of religion in this as well. So it part of it would be, you know, afraid of losing the belief that has the beliefs that have underpinned their life, and having to confront the hypocrisy that they've been taught.
Well, and for me, when you say that, what pops into my head is what is our experience with feeling groundlessness. And so we look for things that ground us. And for me, what I've come to discover is that the power of transformation exists in a state of groundlessness, when anything is possible. And when I release myself from the attachments to my sense of how it's supposed to be. But there's great comfort in that. And so it's a willingness to step out into the unknown.
Where this is really being complicated in the current debate in the UK is in historic gender roles, there is a massive asymmetry between genders around power and violence, and it is generally male on female violence and power, and hence the space, the safe spaces that women have created for themselves, or have been created finally by the world for them, they feel a massive threat to those, and that is a very real and honorable concern, and it's being caught up in all of this, and it risks throwing the trans debate out entirely because of something which is a valid thing that you can't deny.
Yeah, and it's very complicated and layered, because then you have some trans folks who identify as female who want access to that space.
That's right.
And who's the arbiter?
Who's the arbiter? Yeah.
Of that when we think about inclusion. Tessa, can you drop the resources that I had into the chat?
I can do that right now.
Okay, so let me just tell you what I'm dropping into. So I'm sharing 5 resources with you that really are at an organizational and interpersonal level, which I had initially thought we would have more focus on. When I came across that video of Alok, though, which literally was sort of in the moment, and given the topic and the theme of Holocon, I felt compelled to focus a little bit more on that. But the first is an informal audit. One of the things that I invite people often to do is just look around your space, whether it's your physical space or your social media space, and what messages around LGBTQI inclusion are being sent, or in the absence of artifacts, what message is being sent. So it could be as simple as, you know, I put my pronouns, for example, in my name. I used to, when I go into people's offices, I always sort of looked at the titles of the books on their shelves, and sort of what's the message. And when there were certain ways in which people used language or things, artifacts around, I interpreted that as sometimes as a welcoming or a neutral or rarely hostile, but more often neutral message. So it's an invitation for us to think about what is our environment saying. And then Out and Equal is a US based, but it's a global organization on workplace equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and allied folks. And the toolkit for change that we'll put in there is a range of resources for an organizational level, including a survey you can use with clients, with a team, to assess the organizational climate with respect to inclusion. They also have a pronoun guide, which can answer some questions and give some tips around on the use of pronouns. The learning resource list is something I've put together, which is books, articles, videos, blogs, which include, there is actually a podcast with Alok on a show called Man Enough, is the title of the podcast, which is around unpacking masculinity. And it is brilliant. And there's a link to both the audio podcast and a video version of it. There's a lot of other stuff in there as well. And then I put together a tip sheet on trans inclusive communication. And so it's a way for you to inventory your current use of best practices with relation to trans inclusive communication, everything from pronouns to forms and those sorts of things. But it's my suggestion is to look at it and say, which ones of these am I using? Which of these would feel hard to use, and to examine what makes it hard. And maybe have a conversation with people who know you well. Each of you fill it out. I've used this on Teams. Which do we use? Which do I use? What would make it easier for me or for us to use some of these? So you might find those of value. So I'm aware of the time and want to thank you all for, let me stop sharing my screen, for taking the time and for your candor especially. I really appreciate the learning. I know I do this because I learn things each time, and I feel satisfied from that.